The Quiet Panic. I was cleaning out my deceased grandmother's attic when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden beneath decades of dust and forgotten memories was a leather-bound diary that contained the exact date of my death. But that's not even the strangest part. The diary predicted 3 other deaths before mine, and all of them have already come true. This discovery sent me down a rabbit hole that I'm still trying to climb out of. What I found changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about fate, and about the thin line between coincidence and something far more sinister. By the end of this video, you'll understand why I haven't slept properly in weeks and why I'm questioning everything I once believed about free will. My name is Alex, and 3 months ago I inherited my grandmother's house after she passed away at 92. She'd lived in that same Victorian home for over 60 years, and honestly, I dreaded having to sort through all her belongings. The woman was a collector of everything. Newspapers from the 1960s, ceramic figurines, boxes upon boxes of photographs spanning decades. It was overwhelming. I'd been putting off cleaning the attic for weeks. Every time I climbed those creaky stairs, I'd take one look at the mountains of boxes and furniture covered in white sheets. And I'd retreat back downstairs. But last Tuesday, I finally worked up the courage to tackle it. I started with the boxes closest to the stairs, mostly containing old Christmas decorations and my grandfather's war memorabilia. That's when I noticed something strange. In the far corner of the attic, partially hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a small wooden chest that looked completely out of place. Unlike everything else up there, this chest had no dust on it. None. As if someone had been visiting it regularly, keeping it clean. My grandmother had been in a wheelchair for the past 5 years and couldn't possibly have climbed those stairs. The chest wasn't locked, but the hinges creaked like they hadn't been opened in years, which contradicted the lack of dust. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded red silk, was a diary bound in dark leather. The cover was worn smooth and there was no title or name embossed on it. Just blank weathered leather that felt unnaturally warm to the touch. I opened it to the first page, expecting to find my grandmother's handwriting or maybe entries from my grandfather. Instead, I found something that made absolutely no sense. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1987, written in handwriting I'd never seen before, but it wasn't a typical diary entry about someone's day or feelings. It was a list of names, dates, and what appeared to be causes of death. The first entry read, Margaret Thompson, March 3rd, 1987, car accident on Route 34. I knew that name. Margaret Thompson was my grandmother's neighbor who died in a car crash when I was just a kid. I remembered my grandmother being devastated about it, talking about how sudden and unexpected it was. But here was an entry from 2 months before it happened, predicting exactly how she would die. The second entry was even more unsettling. David Chen, November 18th, 1991. Heart attack during morning jog, age 45. David Chen was my grandmother's mailman. I have vivid memories of him because he always gave me candy when I was little. He did die of a heart attack while jogging, exactly as described in the diary, but again, this entry was written years before his death. The third entry made my hands shake. Eleanor Martinez, June 7th, 2023, peaceful passing in sleep, age 92. Eleanor Martinez was my grandmother's full name. She died on June 7th, 2023, exactly as predicted in this diary. The entry was dated 1987, 36 years before her actual death. But it was the fourth and final entry that made me drop the diary and stumble backward into a stack of boxes. Written in the same mysterious handwriting was my full name, Alexander James Martinez, followed by a date that's now exactly 8 months away. The cause of death was listed as drowning, lake accident, 2:47 a.m. I don't know how long I sat there in that dusty attic staring at those 4 entries. My rational mind kept trying to find explanations. Maybe it was some kind of sick joke. Maybe someone had planted this diary as a prank. But the handwriting looked genuinely aged, and the paper had that yellowish tint that only comes with decades of time. Plus, who would know those specific details about deaths that happened years apart? I took the diary downstairs and spent the next several hours researching everything I could about the people mentioned. Margaret Thompson's obituary confirmed she died in a car accident on Route 34 on March 3, 1987. David Chen's death certificate, which I managed to access through public records, showed he suffered a fatal heart attack on November 18, 1991 during his morning exercise routine. My grandmother's death certificate matched perfectly with the diary's prediction. 3 out of 4 predictions had come true with terrifying accuracy. That left just 1 entry remaining. Mine. I tried calling my Aunt Maria, my grandmother's youngest daughter, to ask if she knew anything about the diary. She lived across the country and hadn't been to the house in years, but she might have heard family stories about it. When I described what I'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Finally, she said something that made my stomach drop. "Your grandmother mentioned something once about a family curse." I thought she was just getting confused in her old age. But she said our family had a way of knowing when death was coming. She made me promise never to tell you kids about it because she didn't want to scare you. According to my aunt, my great-grandmother had supposedly possessed some kind of supernatural ability to predict deaths. The story went that she would have vivid dreams about people dying, and those dreams always came true. My grandmother allegedly inherited this ability but tried to suppress it her entire life because it terrified her. She used to wake up screaming, my aunt told me. She'd have these dreams about neighbors, friends, even strangers, and then weeks or months later they'd die exactly as she dreamed. It drove her nearly insane as a young woman. That's why she moved away from her hometown and never talked about her family's history. This explanation should have been comforting in some way. At least it provided a context for the diary's existence. But it also confirmed my worst fear. If the pattern held true, I had 8 months to live. I spent the next week obsessing over every detail in that diary. The handwriting analysis I had done suggested the entries were indeed written decades ago, ruling out any recent fabrication. I researched the specific lake mentioned in connection with my predicted death. It was Cedar Lake, about 2 hours from my current home. I'd never been there in my life, had no plans to visit, and I'm actually a strong swimmer. The more I tried to rationalize away the diary's predictions, the more evidence I found supporting their authenticity. I discovered old newspaper clippings about Margaret Thompson's accident that matched the diary's details perfectly. I found David Chen's jogging route through city planning records, confirming he would have been on the exact street where he collapsed. But here's where things get truly bizarre. As I was researching, I started noticing patterns in my own life that seemed to be pushing me toward that lake. A job opportunity came up that would require me to relocate to a city just 30 minutes from Cedar Lake. My college roommate, who I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly reached out and mentioned he'd bought a cabin near Cedar Lake and wanted to reconnect. It was as if the universe was conspiring to ensure I'd be in the right place at the right time for my predicted death. That's when I made a decision that everyone around me thought was completely insane. I decided to fight back against whatever force was trying to orchestrate my death. If this diary was real, if my family really did have some kind of supernatural connection to death itself, then maybe I could use that knowledge to change my fate. I started by doing everything possible to avoid that lake. I turned down the job opportunity even though it would have doubled my salary. I blocked my old roommate's number and deleted all his messages about the cabin. I researched every possible route between my home and Cedar Lake, then planned my life to avoid all of them completely. But the universe seemed determined to prove me wrong. 2 weeks after I turned down the job, my current employer announced massive layoffs. My department was being eliminated entirely. The only comparable position I could find in the area was with a company that organized outdoor team-building retreats. Guess where their most popular location was? Cedar Lake. I took the job anyway because I needed the income, but I made it clear during the interview that I wouldn't be participating in any lake activities. I'd handle the administrative side from the office. My new boss found this odd but agreed to accommodate my request. For the next few months, I lived in a constant state of paranoia. Every phone call could be the one that would somehow lead me to that lake. Every invitation, every change in my routine, every unexpected event felt like another piece of some cosmic puzzle designed to ensure my death happened exactly as predicted. I started having nightmares about drowning. In these dreams, I was always at Cedar Lake in the middle of the night, the water black as ink around me. I could see the exact time on my watch underwater. 2:47 a.m., just like the diary predicted. I'd wake up gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat, convinced I could still taste lake water in my mouth. The strangest part was how normal everyone else's lives seemed. My friends were planning vacations, starting new relationships, making long-term career moves. Meanwhile, I was living like a person on death row, counting down the days until my execution date. I became obsessed with that diary, reading and rereading every entry, looking for clues I might have missed. That's when I noticed something I'd overlooked before. The handwriting wasn't just old, it was changing slightly between entries. The first entry about Margaret Thompson was written in one style, but by the time it got to my grandmother's entry, the handwriting had evolved. It was still the same person, but the writing had matured, aged along with whoever was making these predictions. I realized the diary wasn't written all at once in 1987. These entries had been added over the years, each one written closer to the actual date of death. This discovery led me to examine the paper more closely. Under a magnifying glass, I could see that each entry was written with slightly different ink, confirming they were added at different times. This meant someone in my family had been actively maintaining this diary for decades, updating it with new death predictions as they received them. The question was who? My grandmother was the obvious suspect, but according to my aunt, she'd tried to suppress her supposed abilities. So why would she be documenting them? I decided to search the house more thoroughly. If there were more clues about my family's dark gift, they had to be hidden somewhere. I spent entire weekends going through every room, every closet, every drawer. In my grandmother's bedroom, behind a loose baseboard, I found a collection of letters tied with a black ribbon. The letters were correspondence between my grandmother and someone named Helena Vasquez, dated from the 1970s through the early 2000s. Helena was apparently my grandmother's cousin, and she lived in a small town in Mexico where my great-grandmother had been born. The letters were written in Spanish, which I barely understood, but I managed to translate enough to piece together the horrifying truth. Helena had the same ability as my great-grandmother. She could predict deaths through dreams and visions. But unlike my grandmother, who tried to ignore her gift, Helena had embraced it. She'd been documenting death predictions for our entire extended family for over 50 years. The diary I'd found was just one of many she'd sent to family members over the years. According to the letters, Helena believed our family was cursed by something she called La Muerte Silenciosa, the silent death. She claimed our bloodline had been marked generations ago, and certain family members would always possess the ability to see death coming. The gift was both a blessing and a curse, allowing us to prepare for loss, but forcing us to live with the terrible knowledge of when it would happen. But here's what changed everything. In the final letter, dated just 3 months before my grandmother's death, Helena wrote something that gave me hope. She mentioned that the predictions weren't set in stone. They were warnings, possibilities that could be changed if the person was strong enough to fight against their fate. She wrote about a nephew who had been predicted to die in a construction accident. He changed careers, moved to a different city, and lived for 20 more years before dying peacefully of old age. The key, according to Helena, was completely disrupting the circumstances that led to the predicted death. This revelation changed my entire approach. Instead of just avoiding Cedar Lake, I needed to make it impossible for the circumstances of my death to occur. The diary said I would drown at 2:47 a.m. during a lake accident, so I made a plan to ensure that could never happen. First, I enrolled in advanced swimming classes and water safety courses. If I somehow ended up in that lake, I was going to be prepared. Second, I started taking sleeping medication that knocked me out completely from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. There was no way I'd be conscious at 2:47 a.m. to get into any kind of accident. Most importantly, I made a decision that my friends and family thought was completely extreme. I booked a flight to leave the country exactly 1 week before my predicted death date. I'd spend a month in Europe, as far from Cedar Lake as possible. If the diary was right about the date, at least I'd be in a completely different time zone when it was supposed to happen. The months leading up to my predicted death date were the most stressful of my life. but also the most liberating. I was taking control of my destiny in a way I'd never imagined possible. I wasn't just passively accepting what some supernatural force had decided for me. I was fighting back. As I write this, I'm sitting in a cafe in Prague, exactly 4,000 miles away from Cedar Lake. My predicted death date was yesterday. According to the diary, I should be dead right now, but I'm not. I'm alive, I'm breathing, and I'm finally starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, we really can change our fate. The diary is still back home in that wooden chest, but its power over me is broken. I've learned that sometimes the most terrifying predictions are just possibilities waiting to be proven wrong. The real curse isn't knowing when you're going to die. It's believing you can't do anything about it. I'll never know for certain whether the diary's predictions were real supernatural visions or just an elaborate psychological trap designed to create self-fulfilling prophecies. But what I do know is this: I refuse to let fear control my life, and I'm still here to tell the story. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is bet everything on the possibility that tomorrow will be different than what everyone expects. And sometimes, if you're willing to fight hard enough for it, you actually win that bet.